not only U.S. War Cabinet members, but also their deputies and other key players together recall their personal memories of the Gulf crisis. They start their story with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait.
Sir Charles, where were you?
I was in Aspen, Colorado, where I just arrived with Mrs. Thatcher, who was there for a meeting with the president the following day. She was staying in the ranch of Ambassador Cato, just outside Aspen. I'd just gone into the hotel. The news came through in a cable from London, a flash cable. I telephoned her straight away out of the ranch, where she was busy unpacking her suitcases.
Mr. Wilson.
We were 8 hours ahead, so it was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and got this phone call. I went over to the telephone and picked it up, and the voice on the other end said, it's the White House calling. So I stood to attention and saluted. I was in my all-together, stark naked. And the phone went dead. So I had to call back and got a hold of Richard's office, and it was his deputy who said, did you have Saddam Hussein's home phone number? I didn't have it on me at the time.
You didn't have anything?
I didn't have anything on it.
I had gone over to town to meet with a friend, and we were simply having a cocktail together when my beeper went off and said, come back immediately.
General Scowcroft and I talked for maybe half an hour, and then it was probably 7 o'clock, 7:30 that evening. He and I decided to walk over from his office in the West Wing of the White House over to the residence to meet with the president. 3 of us were talking about exactly what we knew, what we didn't know, what our options were, and as often happens, the telephone rang. It was Bob Kimmett on the line.
I also called the secretary immediately. By that time, I believe he was in the meeting with Foreign Minister Shevardnadze.
But when we told him that the invasion had actually occurred and that we had actually begun and that we had solid information to this effect, he was a little, I think, a little bit embarrassed and surprised.
Знаете, я ему сказал, что я не верю этому. Не верю. Не потому, что Саддам не может это сделать, ну просто нет логики, элементарной логики. Джеймс вроде согласился, да, я, говорю, согласен, но вот такое сообщение имеется.
What we have is this closed-circuit video television network, if you will, so people can stay at their home agencies and they don't have to waste time traveling and so forth. So Brent and I and some of the people who work with me were down in the White House Situation Room. Bob and his people were at State. Paul Wolfowitz and others were at the Pentagon. The CIA people came in from the agency. And from about 8:30, give or take, that evening till maybe 1:30, 2:30 in the morning, what we really had was a running deputies meeting.
On the 1st of August in the evening, I was having dinner. It was a farewell dinner for Sir Crispin Tickell with one other couple present, when all of a sudden, about 10 o'clock at night, I was called to the phone, went to the waiter station in the hall to the kitchen and got a call from the State Department saying that Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and I was instructed to call an immediate meeting of the Security Council.
The most important thing was really diplomatically to get what ultimately became the foundation, the first of over a dozen United Nations resolutions to make sure that you had the world community squarely against what had happened, calling for its complete and unconditional reversal.
Now, Sir Charles, you were involved in that.
There was a lot of consultation going on in New York immediately between Ambassador Pickering and our Ambassador Sir Crispin Tickell and no doubt many others to get the council together and to have a very, very rapid resolution.
We finished the dinner. I alerted Sir Crispin. In my car on the way to the Security Council, I was able to find the Kuwaiti ambassador who hadn't heard about this, and I went immediately back to my apartment, worked with the Department of State on the phone. We composed a resolution which was pretty much accepted as is.
In New York at the United Nations, the Security Council met through the night, first informally and then in emergency session.
So far, the only tangible response has been economic. America freezing Kuwait's assets there to keep them from Iraqi hands.
I got a call that day from the White House with regard to the freezing of assets, because there was no one in my government that I was able to get any instructions from. And I had to take the initiative to say yes or no, because there was this whole confusion and no one was in a position to give any instructions. And they said, we need your authority to freeze the Kuwaiti assets. I said, of course you have my authority to freeze the Kuwaiti assets before the Iraqis are able to get their hands on it.
I met on the morning of August 2nd with Tariq Aziz, the foreign minister, at about 8:30 that morning. They had cut our telephones to Washington at about 6 o'clock. In fact, I had been on the telephone with Nat Howell in Kuwait when they cut our international lines. So I met with Tariq on the 2nd, laid out what U.S. position, the UN position, on one country invading another UN member state.
It's now 8 a.m. on the 2nd in Washington, and there is a National Security Council meeting about to begin. What was going on at that meeting?
Well, before the meeting, there were two things going on that I remember. I went back to Brent's office. By this point, I had given up using my own because it meant an extra 2 minutes over to the old executive office building. Typed out a statement, brought it back to Brent and the president. Then at 8 o'clock, the press was brought in, not just for the photo op, but to stay there to hear the statement.
We're not discussing intervention. I would not discuss any military options, even if we'd agreed upon them. But one of the things I want to do at this meeting is hear from our Secretary of Defense, our chairman, and others, but not contemplating such action.
The president, from the very outset, never ruled any option out. He told us that privately. He conveyed that publicly. But we were not at that point looking at intervention as the best option. It was way too premature.
And the next phone call I got from Coleman was, well, they're now, we just got reports that they're in downtown Kuwait. That made it an entirely different situation.
Within 12 hours after we got word that the attack had begun, and while we were still watching it unfold, General Schwarzkopf briefed the President and the other members of the National Security Council on what our options could be.
Mr. Wolfowitz, what were the options that were circulating at the table that morning?
One thing I remember about that meeting was that it was a very extensive discussion of all the kinds of things you might try to do through purely political and diplomatic means. So although there was not a lot of discussion in that meeting, as I recall it, about military options, there was a very exhaustive attempt to see what you could do without the use of force, and at least to those of us from the Defense Department sitting there, it was pretty clear where all of that led.
We were all apprehensive that Saddam Hussein was not just going to stop in Kuwait, but would continue to the major Saudi oil fields on the east side of the Gulf. At about 2 a.m. that first night, the Director of Central Intelligence, Judge Webster, and I met with the head of Saudi intelligence to talk with him about what contingencies might be required if Saddam kept moving through Kuwait.
And I spoke to Ambassador Kelly hours after the invasion took place. And I believe he was at home. He was called back to the State Department, and the moment he got to the State Department, he called me back, and we were talking about it. And the next day, the 2nd, I had a meeting with Paul Wolfowitz at the Department of Defense to assess the situation. I had a press conference at 10 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of August, where I took the initiative myself to call for a U.S. intervention here.
We have appealed to all our friends. And I repeat, we have appealed to all our friends around the world, including the United States, to come to our aid and assistance.
We have been in almost hourly contact with the Kuwaiti ambassador over the last 24 hours, and we're going to continue to work closely together.
And I called John again, and I said, John said, are you asking? I said, yes, I am asking. And although I did not have instructions from my government because there was nobody else be able to get in touch with. And that was really the nightmare I had on that day, is I was praying to God, please stop in Kuwait, because as unfortunate as we were to have our country invaded, had he gone into Saudi Arabia, then Kuwait would not have been the primary focus of the world, but rather of Saudi Arabia and other countries. We would have been left on the sideline.
As her plane landed at the Rocky Mountain airstrip, Mrs. Thatcher was being kept informed of events in the Gulf. She's now unreservedly condemned the Iraqi invasion as absolutely unacceptable.
When the president left for Aspen, he had some understanding of the state of our planning and what possibilities existed. Not specific options, but a range of possibilities that he should consider as he thought about this in the course of his trip to Aspen and back.
And the president and I discussed it at length going out to Aspen, and especially the significance of what had happened, more than simply one country invading another little country. That what did it all really mean?
President and Mrs. Thatcher met in Ambassador Cato's ranch, perhaps a slightly unlikely place, tucked up in the hills 10 miles outside Aspen. It was a relaxed meeting, a large room, comfortable room, just the President and Mrs. Thatcher and General Scowcroft, and I was there too.
The President was ready for what Mrs. Thatcher came with, which was the same idea that this is more than just another case of a border incursion or something. This has great significance. So there was a meeting of mind of two. They were both heading in the same direction, and they tended to reinforce each other.
It's been said that Mrs. Thatcher had to put backbone into the president. That's just wrong. I mean, they both arrived there absolutely determined that this was something which could not be tolerated. I think the genuine sense of outrage was the thing I remember most strikingly on the part of both of them, that this should have happened. I think also a slight feeling of history, a memory of what had happened when, in the 1930s, we had failed to move to protect small countries when they had been invaded.
Iraq's invasion of Kuwait defies every principle for which the United Nations stands. If we let it succeed, no small country can ever feel safe again.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
President Bush gave a midday speech that day, which ironically involved the Middle East.
The strategic essence was to change the focus of our defense planning from a global war with the Soviet Union to dealing with regional conflicts. And in fact, in our secret planning, the regional conflicts that were of the greatest concern were in the Persian Gulf, like an Iraqi invasion of Saudi Arabia. This had been planned to be a major unveiling of a new defense strategy, but of course no one noticed in all the other things going on.
The brutal aggression launched last night against Kuwait illustrates my central thesis. Notwithstanding the alteration in the Soviet threat, the world remains a dangerous place with serious threats to important U.S. interests wholly unrelated to the earlier patterns of the U.S.-Soviet relationship.
The two of them then drove back to the ranch, and they had a further discussion there. And the second time, I think, the military aspects were rather more in their mind. Not, as I recall it at that stage, the need perhaps to use force to eject Iraq from Kuwait.
What were the Iraqis likely to do? Were they simply going to stop at Kuwait? Could they just continue marching on down the border into the Saudi oil fields, which were right in the line of march, and what in fact could be done to stop that sort of a thing?
What's going on in the Gulf?
Any new developments, Mr. President?
No, I had a long talk with King Fahd just now.
What did he want?
Well, we're just reviewing options. And
While everything is scurrying about from Aspen to the UN to Washington, there you are in Siberia. What was the Secretary's reaction? At that point, he goes to Mongolia.
Right, and I flew off on Shevardnadze's plane and flew back to Moscow with the Soviet team. It became rather fortuitous that I was doing so. The Secretary told me, his last words to me were, "Stay in touch." And
we got to Mongolia, and the full dimensions of the invasion became apparent. I remember going through with the events that we had planned there. without being able to concentrate too much on exactly what was happening. But coming back to the guest house there in Ulaanbaatar to spend the night and spending practically all of the night on the phone, I talked on several occasions to the president, secure from there, and then talked to Brent Scowcroft.
Well, how do we adjust to this and so on, rather than the notion that this was an unacceptable move, that the United States, that it could not be allowed to succeed. It was more adjusting to it rather than resisting or reversing it.
You reach Moscow, and what's going through your head?
When I got there, Peter Hauslohner, who was someone who was on my staff, suggested to me the idea of having a joint statement with the Soviets. I thought it was a terrific idea, and I called the secretary and I said, I think we ought to have not only a joint statement, but I think you ought to come back here to give it with Minister Shevardnadze, because that will give it real drama, and that will demonstrate for the world to see that the United States and the Soviet Union are right together.
I told him to look further into that, follow up on it, and that if it looked for sure like we could get such a joint statement, then I would come back. I'd canceled the balance of my trip to Mongolia, and I was returning to Washington. I would return to Washington through Moscow.
We had actually planned in advance of the meeting for Sergei Tarasenko, who is Shevardnadze's assistant, and myself to get together to be talking about a range of different issues. And as we walked into his office, the first thing he said to me was, let's find out the latest information. So I thought he was going to pick up the phone and he was going to check on their intelligence to find out what was going on, and instead he goes over and turns on CNN. We then drafted a very quick statement and found a typewriter in English. I mean, we found a non-Cyrillic typewriter and typed it out. He read it over. He called up Shevardnadze and read it to him. Shevardnadze said, sounds good, and I like the idea. Let me call Gorbachev.
We flew the next day to Moscow, met with Shevardnadze in the Moscow airport.
A smiling James Baker arrived at Moscow airport this evening for this brief, hurriedly arranged visit, an opportunity to cash in on the new togetherness between Moscow and Washington. Separately, the United States and the Soviet Union are potent forces. Together, they hope to convince the Iraqis they are unbeatable.
This was a hard decision for the Soviets to take. They had supported Iraq for a long time. They had 8,000, I remember him telling me they had 8,000 Soviet citizens in Iraq, and they were concerned that they were, by doing this, they might be somehow giving us a license for military action, and they wanted us to give them certain assurances that that would not be the case. Shevardnadze said at the time, he said, when the secretary told me a day or so ago that this might be imminent, I was frankly disbelieving of it, and I was quite surprised, and nevertheless, this is something that should not be permitted to happen, and they went forward with a very good joint statement.
Today, we take the unusual step of jointly calling upon the rest of the international community to join with us in an international cutoff of all arms supplies to Iraq.
It's now August 3rd, and the second 8 a.m. NSC meeting takes place.
You had the three senior people at the meeting besides the president. You had Brent Scowcroft, Larry Eagleburger, and Dick Cheney. Each gave a several-minute statement at the beginning.
I had told the president that I was concerned, and I thought we had to get over the significance of this in the world that we were living in, and that if he didn't mind, I would do what I don't usually do at NSC meetings, and that is open the meeting with a statement of the larger significance of this. And he said, well, maybe I should do that. And I remember saying, no, I think it's better that I do it and you sit back and let the debate develop. So that's what I did, and try to set it in a broader stage of the overall significance to U.S. vital interests of what had happened.
I told President Bush what was brought home by Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait was that he did not have to take Saudi Arabia in order to dominate the Gulf. Once he had Kuwait, he had some 20% of the world's oil reserves, and he had the largest army in the neighborhood. he was in a position to dictate policy to everybody else in the Gulf.
The general thrust of what I said was essentially that, Mr. President, this is a far more important issue than simply the invasion of Kuwait, important as that is. This is, in its own way, the first real test of this new world order that we're trying to put together. And if this aggression is permitted to proceed, it sets all the wrong standards for that new world order. It sends messages to the Gaddafis, the Kim Il-sungs, etc., that, if you will, with the collapse of the bipolar world, with the removal of one of the two superpowers, in fact, perhaps the rules of the game have changed, and the pipsqueaks like Saddam Hussein can do more rather than less because they aren't constrained by their big brother. And under these circumstances, it's absolutely essential that the U.S. collectively, if possible, but individually, if necessary, not only put a stop to this aggression, but roll it back.
These are large geopolitical stakes.
Well, thank you.
However you assess the stakes, this was going to be a turning point. It was the first test of what you might call the post-Cold War era, and everybody knew that there was just a sense, a palpable sense of history in the room.
Is it your sense on the 3rd that the President was sharing these views as expressed?
Oh, very much so. The only reason the President held back, I think, based on everything I know from the day, was that once the President speaks at a meeting, it certainly sets the tone, and it can inhibit what other people are prepared to see.
You might say.
You might say.
We view it as a matter of grave concern to this country and internationally as well. What Iraq has done violates every norm of international law.
On day 3, news bulletins reported that if the Iraqis continued to threaten Saudi Arabia, President Bush might use the military option. The build-up of U.S. naval power continued, with carrier-led forces from both the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean heading towards the Gulf. But where to base land forces was an open question.
I remember looking at the map, talking with our experts in the Pentagon, trying to figure out how you would counter 150, 200,000 Iraqi troops, tanks, heavy forces that Saddam had deployed to Kuwait. And it was apparent when you look at the map that unless you can get into Saudi Arabia, there's very little you can do.
Saddam might well have not intended to invade Saudi Arabia, but there must have been great temptation when he saw how easy it was to sweep through Kuwait and find himself on that border. There must have been enormous temptation. And so it was a period of great vulnerability for Saudi Arabia and for our interest in that part of the world.
The administration turned to Prince Bandar, the Saudi ambassador to the United States.
I am not going to discuss intelligence reports confirmed in one way or another, but there is nothing that is encouraging for me that I have seen the Iraqis do recently.
Prince Bandar came into the White House, and we told him of our fears that there was not much time if, in fact, the Iraqis had intentions that went beyond Kuwait, and that it was important to try to do things so that Saudi Arabia could be defended rather than liberated, which would be a very, very different and difficult task.
I was called by General Scowcroft and asked to provide a briefing to Prince Bandar, the Saudi ambassador, to show him what kinds of forces we were prepared to put into the region if, in fact, they agreed to receive U.S. forces. General Powell and I sat down a small round table in my office that Friday afternoon with Prince Bandar, just the three of us.
The Secretary made a few introductory remarks, and then he asked me to brief. And I laid out to Prince Bandar, using a set of charts, what we were prepared to do and how the forces would flow, how many troops we were prepared to send in this first increment, and making it clear to him we would send whatever was needed to deal with the danger.
It was quite clear that the Saudis had reservations about casting their lot with the United States. And Prince Bandar made it quite clear. He said, you know, things have happened before when the Shah was overthrown, he said. the United States asked to send a squadron of F-15s to us, and we said that would be just fine. When they were in the air halfway over, the United States announced that they were unarmed.
This was not reassuring to the Saudis, and they wanted to make certain that the kind of operation that we were proposing this time around was not another exercise by an unarmed F-15 squadron, but that it was real, meaningful force, and that the commitment was significant.
And the plan I laid out for him was our initial defensive force positioning, and laid it out by wing, by division, by number of ships. And he said, well, how much does that all add up to? I said, about 100,000. And he reacted visibly.
It seemed as though this was a rather large number to swallow. Then he broke into a smile and he said, well, at least it shows you're serious.
And a lot of what that weekend was about was a kind of feeling out in both directions. Could we depend on the Saudis? Could they depend upon us? Because clearly each side was mortgaging a lot of its future in the reliability of its partner.
And one of the things I think that the president clearly had in his mind, and one of the things that was absolutely critical in the question of telling Prince Bandar how many troops we were prepared to put in, was to make it clear to the Saudis, for example, that we were not about to get them out on the end of a limb, put in an Air Force squadron, and then when things got rough, we would come home and they'd still be out on the end of the limb. The kinds of remarks that an Arab leader once made, that the United States is short of breath.
So the task was convincing them that we were serious and that we wanted Secretary Cheney to go over and talk to the king, but only if they realized that we were serious and that they would accept this kind of cooperation.
Initially, there was reluctance on the part of the Saudis to accept a delegation.
Any delegation.
Any delegation. And then I think a reluctance to accept one that was headed by a cabinet member. They wanted a lower level, more technically oriented kind of delegation.
The first I was aware of the visit was when I arrived back from my vacation on the 4th of August, and I had a call waiting for me at the airport from General Scowcroft. And when I called him, he said, hello and goodbye. Welcome back to Washington. You're going to Saudi Arabia tomorrow with Secretary Cheney. So I wasn't involved in the preparations for the visit. I was told that we would leave the next morning at 10 o'clock.
Well, we got ready. We packed our bags. We came in early Sunday morning with bags packed. And it was on again, off again, most of Sunday morning. Are we going to go? Aren't we going to go? We started making betting pools on it. And I think we had just about thought we weren't going to go when, about, as I remember it, toward noon, phone call came, we're leaving at 2 o'clock.
Before we go to Saudi Arabia, the president returns from Camp David on Sunday the 5th. And you were instrumental at that moment in time. What was going on at that?
That Sunday afternoon, I was in the White House Situation Room. General Scowcroft called me and said, the president's touching down in 20 minutes or so. I can't make it. Could you please meet him? He's going to want to say some things to the press. And secondly, he just needs a briefing, obviously, on the most recent things. Because one of the things that was clearly becoming obvious was that you had to have a public diplomacy that would complement anything you were doing privately. That you had to speak to this country, the United States, you had to speak to the coalition that was beginning to form, you had to speak to the Arab world, you had to speak to Saddam Hussein. You had to send out multiple messages all the time. It wasn't enough just to do secretive diplomacy here. It wasn't just enough to spend time on telephones. So what I did was just quickly type that out, walked out, and the helicopter landed. The president motioned me over, and he read the piece of paper, which is really, despite all the speculation, fairly mundane stuff. Not much more, really, than what had been happening over the week and a kind of recounting. It was not his coffee order, as Larry had suggested, or something like that, but it simply was some basic talking points, and we knew then he'd get some questions from the press.
I view very seriously our determination to reverse out this aggression. And please believe me, there are an awful lot of countries that are in total accord with what I've just said, and I salute them. They are staunch friends and allies, and we will be working with them all for collective action. This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression
against Kuwait. I've got to go. I have to go to work.
The phrase, "this will not stand," are the president's words. I don't remember how he formulated them. We didn't talk about it precisely what would... As a matter of fact, I think he surprised people by saying them as early, making such a specific declaration as early as he did.
Let's not forget also, I mean, the president was also asked by one reporter that day, if I may recollect, one question, and the president responded by saying,
"Just wait. Watch and learn." Yeah.
I sat there and picked all these words one by one and analyzed them exactly what was going on.
And the president came off as extremely tough, and people thought I'd put him up to it. I hadn't. I don't have that kind of influence. What simply happened there, I think, was his reaction to, you had several dynamics going on. On one hand, the uncertainty, because Secretary Cheney had literally left the airport maybe an hour or two before. The uncertainty about what was going to happen with the United States and Saudi Arabia.
The actual decision to go wasn't finalized until Sunday, and I left Sunday afternoon about 2:30, accompanied by Bob Gates, General Scowcroft's deputy, by General Schwarzkopf, who's our SINC in charge of that part of the world, Paul Wolfowitz, the Undersecretary for Policy.
We had in throwing this delegation together on a Sunday morning, we'd done the usual thing of phone out to the CIA and get some overhead photographs and a briefer who could talk about these photographs. Frankly, to the layman, they sort of looked like, you could have told me those were grasshoppers crawling around in the sand, and I would have believed that.
But they were tanks.
They were tanks, yeah, and we were impressed by that. But you didn't know where they were going to go next. And the real point, and the point we made to the Saudis, and they had no trouble grasping it, was that if these start to move, we'll know at most 12 hours, as we did in Kuwait, before they're going. And that will be too late for us to do anything about it.
And Defense Secretary Richard Cheney, who spent part of the weekend in consultations with Mr. Bush, is leaving about now for Saudi Arabia. Washington is worried that that country may not be prepared to join in an international effort against Iraq, but may favor trying to appease Saddam Hussein.
And I recall a telephone conversation en route to Saudi Arabia with General Powell, who was back in the Pentagon, where we discussed all of the things that could go haywire if, in fact, Saddam Hussein simply had been willing to press his advantage and come on south immediately before we could get heavy forces into the region.
On the airplane, I went up and spoke privately with Secretary Cheney, and we talked about the strategy for dealing with King Fahd and the Saudis, and basically along the lines of a low-key presentation that outlined the threat, that described what we were prepared to do in response.
We were operating on the assumption that this was an open question for them, that it would involve a historic change in Saudi policy of great consequence, and that there was a lot riding on the outcome of this decision that they were about to make. Originally, we were going to meet about noon. Meeting was postponed until about 7 o'clock in the evening. King Fahd likes to work late at night. He's a night person.
Secretary Cheney outlined the threat as we saw it, what we knew that the Iraqis had done in Kuwait, the size of the force that they had there, the ambiguous signals that we were getting as to what their intentions were with respect to Saudi Arabia, and then finally having General Schwarzkopf present the plan of what we were prepared to do.
The President's message was very clear, and that's if asked to defend Saudi Arabia, we would. We would also leave when asked to leave, and we wouldn't establish any permanent bases. And I think that based upon the decision-making processes as we'd seen them over here before, I was quite sure in my own mind anyhow that we'd been told, thank you very much, I now need to confer with my advisors, and the King would tell us this, and then he would, subsequently give us an answer.
Instead, at the end of about a 2-hour presentation, there was a brief conversation between the King and his advisors in Arabic, which I did not understand at the time, and then he turned back to me and said through his interpreter that they accepted.
After the presentation, there was a good deal of discussion in the room in front of us among the king and his senior advisors. And at one point, one of them said, but we should wait for, he said something like, we should wait for unambiguous warning. And His Majesty replied something to the effect that after the presentation, there was a good deal of discussion in the room in front of us among the king and his senior advisors. And at one point, one of them said, but we should wait for, he said something like, we should wait for unambiguous warning. And His Majesty replied something to the effect that the Emir waited for unambiguous. After the presentation, there was a good deal of discussion in the room in front of us among the king and his senior advisors. And at one point, one of them said, but we should wait for, he said something like, we should wait for unambiguous warning. And His Majesty replied something to the effect that the Emir waited for unambiguous warning, and now the Kuwaitis are a nation living in hotels.
I left the meeting with the king and went back to the quarters where they'd put us up, and got on the telephone and called President Bush, who was then at that moment meeting in the Oval Office with Prime Minister Thatcher.
As if to highlight the urgency of the situation, Mrs. Thatcher was, unusually, helicoptered into the center of Washington for her meeting with Mr. Bush. He regards her support in his efforts to force the Iraqis to back down as vital, and he's not being disappointed.
So I called the President with the news that the King would indeed accept forces, and asked the President over the telephone for his authority, his permission to go ahead and deploy the force. We had them stand by, ready to go. No, I needed an immediate sign-off if we were going to move. And so he immediately authorized me to do that. I, in turn, called General Powell, who was back here in the Pentagon, and gave him the order to deploy the force, and it began that process right away.
And it was about mid-afternoon, something like 3 or 4, when Secretary Cheney called me and said, we have the King's approval. I have advised the President and get going. And in our system, nothing moves until a civilian political leader, the President and the Secretary of Defense, says it moves. And so I made a few phone calls to the various commanders of the armed forces of the United States, or specified and unified commanders, to start the transportation system moving, the forces moving, Schwarzkopf's headquarters moving.
General Schwarzkopf is right there, and I remember we were in this royal guest house somewhere in Jeddah, and he and his staff took over 2 rooms, and it was basically a command post all night long, just phone calls going back and forth fairly frantically.
We were having a meeting of the Deputies Committee and pondering seriously at what point we informed the Allies and the Arabs that we were going to deploy major forces. And, you know, people were saying, do we do it tomorrow at noon, or should the President announce it? And suddenly we discovered that there had been an unclassified message sent out by a sergeant at McGuire Air Force Base asking for the flight clearances for 530 tankers and cargo planes, and laying out the entire deployment to the world. And this had already gone to every country in the world that was involved. And, you know, in effect, Sergeant Smith, or whatever his name was, had made a wonderful decision and that preempted the idea of who was going to inform the Allies and everybody else.
And of course, by keeping it unclassified, it didn't leak.
and everyone was an addressee on the telegram except the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
And the State Department.
I might say that I think that our lack of precision actually confused the Iraqis. The Iraqis were not at all clear as to what we were going to do or how we were going to react during those first few days. They weren't sure whether we were going to move forward through a UN Security Council mechanism as we had begun, or whether our response was going to be unilateral, basically B-52s bombing Baghdad. And Saddam, in my meeting with him on August 6th, made that pretty clear in one of his statements to me.
And what was the mood of the meeting on the 6th with Saddam? Did the question of Saudi Arabia come up?
Oh, very much so. Saddam was very aggressive in the meeting. He came to the meeting wearing his field marshal's uniform, complete with Colt 45 on the hip. He attempts to create an ambiance of intimidation. Clearly, in the meeting on August 6th, it was that. He has some mannerisms and some ploys that he uses to attempt to make you as uneasy as he possibly can make you, including such things as wearing a gun to the meeting. He then leaned forward in his chair and lectured me for about 45 minutes as to why the Iraqis had felt that their national interests had been threatened by the Kuwaiti economic war against them, and how they had no intention of invading Saudi Arabia because they had a non-aggression pact with Saudi Arabia, and therefore would not move forward. And I remember quite clearly, I asked for a clarification on a couple of the things that he had said, and talking about the Kuwaiti government. He said to me, the Al-Sabah family is history, making it quite clear that the Al-Sabah family was not going to be permitted to return to power.
A week ago, Washington was closing down for the August holiday. The president was packing his bags and heading for his coastal retreat. Now he is in almost constant consultation with his advisors and officials. A crisis cabinet meeting this morning was followed by a briefing at the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters.
We were about 45 minutes off the ground, and I got a call from Washington, from Scowcroft's office, saying that the president wanted us to go to see Mubarak on our way home. And so I conveyed that to Secretary Cheney and General Schwarzkopf. And we landed in Cairo only to learn that Mubarak was in Alexandria.
I always remember it because I flew from Cairo down to Alexandria in a small little twin-engine prop plane that the U.S. Army keeps at our embassy over there, and landed right next to the Iraqi jet that was carrying the Iraqi vice president, who was making the rounds then trying to drum up support for the Iraqi position and justify their action of having invaded Kuwait.
So in terms of the visuals for the Arab world, it wasn't too good because we had this huge Iraqi jet behind us and this little tiny American airplane parked on the tarmac right in front of it. The contrast was not an appealing one as we were looking toward a possible conflict.
But I went in to see President Mubarak and told him what we were doing. He, of course, had been talking with President Bush. One of the things that's characteristics throughout the whole crisis is the president working the phones. In every place I went, he had greased the skids, so to speak, in front of me, which is enormously helpful in building on his personal relationships. Told President Mubarak we were going to deploy forces. I also asked for permission to pass one of our aircraft carriers through the Suez Canal. The carrier was the Eisenhower, which was deployed in the Med, and we wanted to immediately move it down to the Red Sea, just off the Saudi coast, to provide air cover in case Saddam Hussein did make a move south. And President Mubarak said, when do you want to move the carrier? I said, tonight. He said, okay.
The American aircraft carrier Eisenhower, a fifth of a mile long, moves ponderously down the Suez Canal under nuclear power towards the Gulf and whatever awaits her in the way of action there.
There was a period of time there, and it was a lot longer than any of us in the Defense Department liked, where all we had there were basically aircraft and some lightly armed ground troops, and nothing on the ground that really could stop large tank columns if they moved forward.
And that was, in some ways, I thought, for a lot of us, those were probably the worst couple of days of the crisis, once you got over the initial shock of the invasion, where the gap between what Iraq had or could bring to bear and what we actually had on the ground or in the area, the gap was probably the largest it ever was for the entire crisis.
I was confident that once, reasonably confident, I should say, that once U.S. forces began to arrive and the American flag was planted in the desert, he would have to think twice. He might still decide to gamble, but at that point, a little colorful, the kind of language I use in the privacy of my office, he was pulling on Superman's cape.
Sometimes these choices are not easy. Today, as president, I ask for your support in the decision I've made to stand up for what's right and condemn what's wrong, all in the cause of peace. Thank you, and God bless the United States of America.
350,000 troops started to move toward Saudi Arabia, Hussein still did not understand, as any junior military officer in the United States would have understood, that he was going to lose.
We were going to go to communicate. We wanted to make certain that that the Iraqis knew eyeball to eyeball from us that we were serious. We were deadly serious.
After Iraq invaded Kuwait, President Bush was still giving every appearance of enjoying his usual summer holiday in Kennebunkport, Maine. But on August the 22nd, he summoned his war cabinet to a crisis meeting.
When the President has gone to Kennebunkport in the summers, General Scowcroft and I have split the time up there, and this meeting took place during the time I was up there with my children. And I wasn't seeing much of them because of all the preparations for the war. Everyone else flew up from Washington, Scowcroft, Powell, Cheney.
Frequently, and especially in the summertime, end up in the middle of a crisis meeting at Kennebunkport for one reason or another. It's a beautiful setting, of course, out on Walker's Point, jutting out into the Atlantic.
The decision the President was faced with that afternoon was, do we act now to show our determination that we are going to use force to intercept Iraqi shipping, or do we take a little bit more time?
The crisis had begun 4 days earlier.
An American frigate has fired warning shots at an Iraqi tanker in the Gulf. It fired 6 times across the bows of a tanker which had refused to stop. Iraq, which had earlier called the blockade an act of war, said there would be grave consequences if any more shots were fired.
Back in Washington, the day-to-day running of the crisis was in the hands of the War Cabinet's deputies, here brought together again by Richard Pearl.
We had, it seemed like, 2 or 3 deputies meetings a day, and we were tracking Iraqi ships heading for Aden, and there was a lot of debate about what the significance would be if it got to Aden.
This was a specific test being thrown down by Saddam Hussein. This did not just seem to be ships coming in through the normal course. I think the numbers of ships and the fact, if I recall, that some were heading toward Iraq, others are going from Iraq to Yemen, seemed to us, again, to be a bit of testing on his part to see if these international sanctions, which again were a rather new art form, would in fact be enforced.
There was a real concern, I think, that all of us felt that if we went on too long with us warning the Iraqis, telling them to stop and saying there was a blockade and not doing anything to enforce it, that at the very least Saddam Hussein was going to misinterpret us as weak, and possibly other people.
All the leaders in the region asked, is the U.S. serious? Is it going to stay the course?
The legitimate government of Kuwait would like to see these sanctions enforced, as indeed would most of the rest of the world, so that this aggression can be reversed and further aggression can be deterred.
As James Baker flew to his holiday in Wyoming, the Gulf strategy hung on one question.
The question was whether or not we should proceed under Article 51, which we were all asserting we had a full legal right to do, or whether, in order to keep the coalition together, we should take a little bit longer and try and get yet another resolution from the Security Council authorizing use of force to enforce the embargo.
There was always the tension between when you used the United Nations and when you went to the United Nations and when you didn't. We could have done it alone, we could have done it with what we had, but you had to think of this not just as a narrow exercise, but as trying to keep together this large coalition for purposes down the road that might even be more ambitious.
I think it was particularly important to get the Soviets on board. Again, we were getting very close to use of force.
The Americans needed Soviet backing if they were to get a resolution through the United Nations. But in Moscow, the Soviets had just opened negotiations with the Iraqis.
The Iraqi Deputy Prime Minister went to Moscow, and they clearly were seeing if they could separate the Soviets from us. At least that was our interpretation of what was going on. Shevardnadze, in talking to Secretary Baker on August 20th, said, we think we have a chance to get the Iraqis to pull out, to live up to the terms of 660 and to withdraw unconditionally. But we need a little bit of time to do that.
I was talking 2 and 3 times a day from my cabin in Wyoming to Shevardnadze in Moscow and to the president back in Maine. Shevardnadze was asking us to, I think he asked us to give him 5 days. We felt that that was a little bit too long.
The secretary was saying at the same time to him, there is not a lot of time. We have this early test. It's important for us to stay together. It's important to do this on the basis of Security Council resolutions if we can, but not at the price of allowing them to either break the coalition or allowing them to think that, in fact, they can separate us.
We ultimately agreed that we could maybe wait 3 days or the ships would get too far down to the point that we would not be able to do anything about it.
With 2 of the 3 days already expired, the War Cabinet assembled at Kennebunkport. The moment had come for the President to decide whether to stop the defiant Iraqi ships.
So the question was, do we do it now to make sure there is no mistaken belief on Saddam's part that he can get away with this, or do we wait a few days in order to have a far more cohesive coalition package to do it with full benefit of Soviet support, UN support, and whatnot?
It was a fairly hotly debated issue. Some argued that that we couldn't afford to let these ships get away after issuing the strong statements that we had issued, that we would look like a paper tiger. It was a bad way to get the military part of this off the ground in a way by seeming to back down at the very outset and let these tankers slip through.
Would we intervene unilaterally, or would we go to the UN, not knowing at that point whether we would get authority? And we were divided on the issue, and I wanted to move, and Secretary Baker didn't.
The president was being pushed by some others to move a little bit more quickly, and I was counseling him to at least give us a chance to see if we couldn't bring the Soviets along.
With James Baker on holiday, the State Department was represented at the meeting by his deputy.
I was, as is usually the case, on both sides of the issue. Until I got a call from Secretary Baker, at which point I became a firm advocate of waiting a little longer.
I'm interested in how your boss changes your mind.
It's very easy.
The President was busy on the phone, as were Secretary Baker and Secretary Cheney. General Scowcroft was in the President's little study with the President as he made his phone calls.
There were a number of phone calls. Most of them were between me and Charles Powell, who was Mrs. Thatcher's national security advisor. And she was urging action.
One of the main problems we faced in British politics at that time was the desire, the determination of quite a number of people in Parliament and in the media to say, will you, the government, promise that you will never ever use force and in these circumstances without a specific authorizing resolution of the United Nations? And Mrs. Thatcher, very rightly, was not prepared to be tied down like that.
Finally, the President and Mrs. Thatcher talked on the issue, and he finally convinced her that it was best to go to the UN.
Yes, I think she was getting quite agitated, and she used one of her famous, extremely diplomatic phrases, for which she's absolutely renowned.
She says, "All right, George, all right, but this is no time to go wobbly." And we used that phrase almost daily after that.
Now the question is, how much more UN action benefits this idea of the world staying more closely together? And I might be prepared to give a little time, speaking just for the U.S. We're only one country there, important one though it may be.
The President came down very strongly on the side of waiting for the UN resolution. But I want to convey it was a very tough call.
While we were deliberating, did that ship get through that was being shadowed by the Reed?
It did get through, didn't it?
It did, and ultimately we let one get taken.
But I think it's also important, at least my impression the president showed more than a little frustration at that Kennebunkport meeting about all of this process. He decided we should wait, but there is no doubt in my mind that if we had not, at some reasonable time, gotten the UN support, he would have gone ahead and acted unilaterally.
The next day, the president and I went fishing. The president loves to fish, and this particular summer was not a great bluefish summer. We were out there for about 4 hours, and the bluefish really were not biting, and we started to talk in a way that we really don't have the opportunity to do in almost any other circumstances. You're out there on a boat in the ocean, there's absolutely nothing to do. And so we started talking about the end of the Cold War and the possibilities, and now that the Soviets for the first time really had joined us in a third world, if you will, crisis situation, whereas before each third world crisis automatically became a test of wills between the United States and the Soviet Union. And did this open up the possibilities for what came to be called a New World Order?
At the end of the third day, Shevardnadze called me back and he said, well, we've made our run at the Iraqis. We're not going to be able to get anything done, so we'll go with you on that resolution. And they voted with us.
The UN resolution brought Iraq's trade to a halt. But the president still faced a problem that had driven one of his predecessors from the White House.
Mr. President, what about the hostages?
I just don't like taking questions on serious matters on my vacation. So, you know, it's just not a good thing to keep doing it like this.
Was the ghost of Jimmy Carter's handling of the hostages in Iran stalking the White House?
It wasn't just that. I mean, we had all seen what can happen when an administration talks too much about it, and you can become hostage to a hostage crisis. And we were hoping that just maybe these people could get out if we didn't make it a major object of our diplomacy ourselves. We specifically avoided talking about it. The so-called H word never got mentioned for several weeks, and we felt that the only choice at that point was to come clean. And at the last minute, I remember the president inserted it. I think it was the speech, the Veterans and Foreign War speech.
We've been reluctant to use the term hostage, but when Saddam Hussein specifically offers to trade the freedom of those citizens of many nations he holds against their will in return for concessions, there can be little doubt that whatever these innocent people are called, they are in fact hostages. And I want there to be no misunderstanding. I will hold the government of Iraq responsible for the safety and well-being of American citizens held against their will.
As this was coming on television, I was sitting with an Arab ambassador who said what we really ought to do is we ought to engage in a bit of public diplomacy and make the point that Saddam Hussein likes to call himself an Arab knight, but true Arab knights don't hide behind the skirts of women and children. And about the same time, Sir Charles, Mrs. Thatcher went down on the floor of the House of Commons and said roughly the same thing.
It is strange for someone who claims to be the leader of the Arab world, a latter-day Saladin, to hide behind women and children.
Of course, the choice of Saladin was never very skillful, because I defer to the Middle East experts, but I believe Saladin was a Kurd.
Within a matter of days, Saddam came out and announced that women and children would be permitted to leave, and that was positive reinforcement that you could get under their skin and provoke the sort of results that you wanted. I have put a bottle of California champagne in the icebox. I will uncork it when I see these people with their exit visas and on the airplane.
It would be over 3 months before all the male hostages had followed the women out of Iraq. The propaganda war went on.
You know, a few days later, there was another signal to Saddam, an extraordinary one, an unprecedented one, and that was the President of the United States addressing the people of Iraq over Iraqi national television.
Yeah, this was one of my greater diplomatic successes, as a matter of fact. What we wanted to do was to try to get the Iraqis to agree to play a tape of the president speaking to the people of Iraq. So a tape was made, and then the issue came, how do we present this? How do we deliver this to the Iraqis? So we choreographed this very nice scheme where the ambassador would come in, we would have the television there to take pictures of him sitting down and my sitting there across from him. So I said, oh, well, here we go. So I proceeded to try to hand him the tape, and he refused to take it.
Your charge of affair in Baghdad. Or the first time. Yes.
And I, with the wit that is always the case when you're pressed like this, allowed us out of the press that I had expected it to work this way. And what I really wanted was to show the American people how nasty he was, because he was a sleazy little fellow.
In the end, did you manage, Secretary Kelly, to get the tape there? And
somebody flew to Amman, Jordan with the tape and went in overland and gave it to Joe, and you ought to pick up the story from there.
So I got it and went over to the Foreign Ministry and gave it to the Foreign Ministry Undersecretary. This is the message from President Bush to the Iraqi people, which I'm on my way to deliver, and I have a meeting in about 10 minutes at the Foreign Ministry on this.
There's also a serious side even before all this, which is when we initially...
I thought the whole thing was serious.
Be that as it may. There'd been a lot of talk about how we potentially would lose the so-called Arab street, the man and woman in the Arab world. How in Iraq we just had a pretty good hunch that the truth wasn't getting through. And it was our hope, and quite honestly, we were pleasantly surprised that we got this 8-minute or whatever opportunity to get the word out.
It has been suggested that one way out of the Gulf crisis would be if the Americans abandon their support for the ruler of Kuwait, Sheikh Jabbar al-Ahmad al-Sabah, and in return the Iraqis pulled out. Forget it. The Emir came to Washington today as an honored guest, the man the United States will, if necessary, go to war for, to return him to his country.
The Emir called and said, you know, I must present to the President some symbolic gift. Of course, you know that the Emir, after he left Kuwait, we have nothing. I mean, everything was looted, and what do you have at the embassy that I could present to the President? And I looked at my inventory in the embassy, and I had virtually also nothing at that time except a small map of Kuwait, which is in brass. So I said to the Emir, I said, that's the only thing I have. He said, well, that will do.
He is a taciturn man, not given to emotion or long speeches and so on, but he was describing the plight of his people, the kinds of things that were happening inside Kuwait, the desperation that he felt for his people.
After the meeting, we strolled through with the Emir and the President through the Oval Office, and he had the small picture there with this brass Kuwaiti map, and the President turned around to the Emir and said, well, is there anything else I could do for you? And the Emir said, Mr. President, all I need is this, pointing to the map, and the President responded forcibly. He said, that's what you're going to get.
The President had already made up his mind on what he was going to do before that meeting. It reconfirmed the determination that the President had. It reconfirmed all the suspicion of the atrocities and torture and the violence that was being perpetrated by the Iraqi forces. It reconfirmed that Saddam Hussein and his people were evil thugs.
No one knew when the sanctions were first imposed how Saddam Hussein himself would react to them. I think there was a chance that seeing this kind of coalition built up against him, seeing himself deprived of all the financial benefit he hoped to get from taking Kuwait, and even deprived of the oil revenues he used to enjoy before, he might have made a decision, this isn't worth it, I'm pulling out.
We were all hoping that this gentleman would come to his senses at some point. But as you went into October, and we discussed all this, started to lose hope, and it clearly indicated he was prepared to risk the lives of many tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers to see what lay at the end of this little passion play.
The Secretary and General Powell were asked to start looking at what a plan might be like if we had to use military force to get him out.
Okay, I was then asked, how would you eject the Iraqis from Kuwait if you had to do it? And I immediately went back and said, I don't have the necessary forces in place to do that. And they said, yeah, but if you had to do it, right now with the forces you have, what would you do? So we put together a plan which based upon the forces that were available at that time, would be the plan that we would have to use.
Around October 10th that General Johnston, Schwarzkopf's chief of staff, came back to Washington to brief that plan.
But when that plan was briefed immediately followed by a statement which said that is not what the Commander-in-Chief of Central Command is recommending. It is a weak plan and it is not the plan we choose to execute. And here are all the things that are wrong with it, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and J, and a lot more. And if, in fact, we are serious about, in fact, ejecting them from Kuwait, what we need is more forces to be able to execute a proper campaign.
We would have been in a position where all we could do is a straight up the center assault into Kuwait itself. And
which would be terribly costly.
It would have been very costly. That's where he had all of his heavy formations. That's where he dug in significantly. It was the worst possible kind of strategy to pursue from a military standpoint. Very costly in terms of casualties. And we did not want to do that.
I remember feeling this looks a bit like the charge of the Light Brigade. If everything worked exactly perfectly according to plan and we were at the right place and the Egyptians were at the right place at exactly the right time, it could work. But not only was there all of that had to work right, if anything went wrong, there was nothing left to defend Saudi Arabia. There were no reserves to throw into the breach. It was quite obvious and sort of dramatically obvious that if you were going to conduct an offensive option responsibly, you had to have more force there.
Yes, sir. And what you're doing is very important because it sends a message that this is a new era. It is a new world. The United States and the Soviet Union are cooperating. The UN is working again. But there are still bad people in the world. Mr. Hussein, Saddam Hussein, is a bad person.
I went out to Saudi Arabia in, I guess, the third week of October thereabouts to talk to Norm Schwarzkopf, get a sense of how the planning was coming. We had spirited discussions, as only military professionals can have when they're dealing with a problem of this nature. And we all were in agreement as to the nature of the additional force that would be required.
And I said, if the enemy changes, then we may have to change this plan. But right now, this is the way I see it happening. He never changed.
And I then flew back to Washington to advise the Secretary of Defense and the President of what additional forces would be required.
I remember being in the room with Secretary Cheney and General Powell when they were reviewing some of the first plans about how we would use the larger force and what became eventually the westward sweep through Iraq.
That would keep his forces pinned and focused upon what was happening from the south into Saudi Arabia, and then execute a flanking attack around to the west to cut off his forces from behind.
And I remember General Powell took his flashlight pointer and pointed it straight at the heart of Kuwait, and he said, while all of this is going on, we have to keep Saddam Hussein's attention right there.
The point I made was there is an army in Kuwait that has to be ejected. And everything we do has to gear itself to that purpose and not be, not fritter resources or assets away from that purpose. And whenever I would brief the deputies or with the principals or even in the Oval, I would use this laser pointer, which showed a little red laser beam on the map. And after a while, it got, some people liked it and some people started to get hypnotized by it. But I always used it. The President liked it, so that's why.
General Powell briefed us on that plan. We, in effect, presented it to the President and said, here's what we would like to do.
We decided the thing to do was to bring in a heavy corps from Germany, the 7th Corps, equipped with the most modern armored fighting vehicles we have and fighting systems that we have, and simply go around them. And for good measure, we threw in the great Big Red 1 Division from Fort Riley, Kansas, to make sure the 7th Corps was a full 3-division corps. And several more aircraft carriers to make sure that Norm would never want for airplanes. If we had stayed at the Defense Force and not added, it probably would have capped out at about 250,000 by early December, and that would have ended it. This was going to double it. And President listened carefully. Questions were asked, but he never hesitated.
I have today directed the Secretary of Defense to increase the size of U.S. forces committed to Desert Shield to ensure that the coalition has an adequate offensive military option should that be necessary to achieve our common goals.
And so the president decided to keep on deploying. But since we viewed it as a continuum, we did not probably sufficiently consult with the Congress and make them aware of what we were doing and the rationale for it. So it was a surprise and an unpleasant one for the Congress.
Well, the call from Secretary Cheney in the morning of the 8th, not very elaborate, just an announcement the administration was doubling the forces. This, of course, had never been discussed with the congressional leadership group that had been visiting the White House in previous weeks.
I did have the responsibility of calling several members of Congress to notify them of the president's decision. Many of them were supportive and agreed with it. Some did. Sam was concerned about it.
In my opinion, before we embark on an offensive action, that we should have a congressional debate, and I think we ought to have the country behind the men and women who are there before we go into a war.
As the president heads to the Middle East to shore up troop morale, back home, support for his Persian Gulf policy continues to erode. A new CNN Time poll shows that while 53% of Americans approve of Mr. Bush's handling of the Gulf crisis, that's down 30 points since August.
The administration's position, as I recall it, was that they were willing to have a vote if all else failed, as long as it was a sort of not accompanied by a divisive debate, and if the outcome was more or less certain to be supportive of the administration. We couldn't guarantee the outcome.
So Congress held hearings questioning whether the administration were abandoning sanctions too quickly.
If, in fact, the sanctions will work in 12 to 18 months instead of 6 months, the trade-off of avoiding war with its attendant sacrifices and uncertainties would, in my estimation, be more than worth it.
If the president were to ask me today, can you guarantee that these sanctions will work within a year or two, the answer is no, I cannot. Sanctions working doesn't mean just destruction of the Iraqi economy. It means getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait.
The Democrats in Congress held a meeting.
We had one session that was devoted entirely to the crisis in the Gulf. And I have to tell you that I have never been so politically stunned in my life as I was by that session, because I was literally the only one of those present who argued that we had vital interests at stake, that the sanctions were not likely to do the job, and that we had to be prepared to use force if necessary to achieve our objectives. I came away feeling that the president was skating on exceedingly thin political ice.
If I haven't done as clear a job as I might on explaining this, then I got to do better in that regard, because I know in my heart of hearts that what we are doing is right.
There were many times and many moments where you could see the political support slipping away. You could see people beginning to question the president. He had terrible problems with the Congress, and this was not as easy as people being Monday morning quarterbacks think that it was.
Unable to count on the support of Congress, the administration turned to the United Nations.
When we began discussions about going to the Security Council for a resolution authorizing the use of force, it was quite clear that that would give us such a boost in terms of international public opinion, but also domestic public opinion and public opinion with the Congress, because it would put us, frankly, in the position of being able to say to a congressman who would not vote for this, you mean you're not willing to support the president, but the Prime Minister of Ethiopia will support the president? I mean, so it really was important if we felt we could get it. It was decided that I would visit with each and every government on the Security Council, the most important being the Soviet Union, because we felt that if we could get the Soviet Union to agree to the use of force, China would not veto.
When he got in there and he sat down with Shevardnadze to begin the day, Shevardnadze said, "Have you really thought about what it means to use force? Have you asked all the right questions? And the implication was, look, I have my own memories of what our military told us about Afghanistan. And are you confident that you can use force and be successful? Because he said, if you go down this path, and we're going to go down it with you, or at least I'm going to suggest that we go down it with you, the critical factor here is that you must succeed. You must use force, and it must be decisive, and it must be unmistakable what the outcome is. So are you confident that you can do that?
He was asking questions about how long did we think it would take, what did we think would be required, and so we had General Howie Graves, who traveled then frequently with me, and was on my delegation during this trip. We had him actually come in and give Shevardnadze a rather detailed briefing of our military plans, something that probably was unprecedented to have again. The United States briefing the Soviet Union in detail on its possibly prospective military operations.
And then Shevardnadze went and called Gorbachev, and he told us he was going to go out and see Gorbachev before we went out and saw him. And we then traveled out to Gorbachev's dacha outside of Moscow.
Well, I remember that when we began the meeting, I remember President Gorbachev saying, well, the first thing we must do is to stick together.
If we let a thug like this get away with what he's done, then there'll be no hope for the kind of new international reality that we would like to see.
He said, we will have difficulty with this, the idea that you're going to go in there, because after all, the force that's going to be used is American forces, and you're asking the Soviet Union to vote to approve the use of American force against a longtime ally of the Soviet Union. I mean, to sell this to their military and to their public after 40 years of looking at the United States as evil incarnate was not the easiest thing in the world.
Gorbachev suggested that, well, maybe what would be useful would be two resolutions. One resolution that would authorize the use of force, but a second resolution later on that would allow you to implement that resolution.
To do two resolutions, the way Gorbachev initially suggested, would mean that we would have to take this very difficult issue of the use of force twice to the Security Council, and we thought that would be an almost impossible burden to overcome.
And the Secretary said, with something of this sort, it's important that we do it at the same time. We can build in a time period. We can have one resolution and say it doesn't actually become operative until a certain date.
But what concerned me mostly is that the date that was agreed upon was 15th of January, and there we were at the end of November. That tantamounts to telling a burglar who's coming to your home, well, you stay in my home, loot, kill, torture, rape, whatever you want. I will not dial 911 until 6 weeks from now.
Setting a pause for peace period in there until January 15, giving Saddam Hussein that much time, was something that that the Soviets and some others really insisted upon if they were going to vote for the resolution to use force.
I think when we left there, we felt fairly confident that we had them on board. We didn't have a firm commitment. Certainly the indications from Shevardnadze and Gorbachev's body language was such that they were clearly very strongly inclined to do this.
In quest of support, the administration traveled. President Bush spent the Thanksgiving holiday in Saudi Arabia, eating the traditional turkey with the troops.
So we don't any more Vietnam, that's right. There won't be any. Anybody's asked to fight, they're going to fight and win.
But there was no turkey dinner for Secretary Baker.
Thanksgiving Day, Secretary Baker and a few of us went to Yemen, Sana'a, and spent Thanksgiving Day. I'm not sure that President Saleh knew it was Thanksgiving for us, negotiating with him and having a meal with him, trying to get the Yemeni vote in the Security Council for the critical resolution on the use of force. As we left, President Saleh said Yemen was undecided on its position, and one Yemeni official remarked as we walked out, well, everything has its price.
A week later, the Security Council met to vote on a resolution authorizing the use of force against Iraq.
Those who have breached the peace should know that all necessary means will indeed inexorably be used against them.
And a few minutes before the session convened, the Yemeni ambassador told me that his instruction was to vote against the resolution. And I told Secretary Baker that, and then went back to the Yemeni ambassador and told him to tell Sana that that would be a grievous mistake and possibly also very costly, since we then had an aid program for Yemen and a number of our friends also did.
The war option would deprive humanity of an historic opportunity to
the concluding line in the permanent representative from Yemen's speech was something to the effect, we should give peace a chance. And I'm sure the Iraqis and others were clapping in the balcony there watching the proceedings. And I did say that I thought that that might be the most expensive applause that he would receive. And it has been somewhat expensive.
Yemen and Cuba voted against. The next day, all U.S. aid to Yemen was cancelled. The administration's lobbying abroad had paid off.
This meeting is adjourned.
We were now faced with a lot of questions from the American people, from congressional leaders and others. And it was very important to the President felt that we be able to show that we had left no stone unturned for peace, that we were not just willy-nilly going off to war without being willing to make a major effort.
He was pretty clear in his own mind what was going to have to be done, and that is the use of force, and unless Saddam Hussein simply caved, and he did not think that would be the case. But he said, I want to make sure that I've left no stone unturned, and I don't want people to be able to say, well, if you had only done this. The President said, therefore, I want to offer direct talks.
To go the extra mile for peace, I will issue an invitation to Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz to come to Washington at a mutually convenient time during the latter part of the week of December 10th to meet with me. In addition, I'm asking Secretary Jim Baker to go to Baghdad to see Saddam Hussein.
It surprised me, it surprised many that this decision was made, because the Iraqis, I think, listening to the debates that were taking place in the United States, the hearing in Congress, the experts, all those television programs, I think they were convinced that the U.S. did not have the guts to go to war or to fight for Kuwait.
Anything that you did to generate support domestically was inclined to make your international coalition nervous, such as talking to the Iraqis before you go to war. Anything you did with the international to beef up the international coalition, such as going to war without talking, made your domestic constituency nervous. And we had to maintain the support of both.
All you can do is manage it, you can deal with it, you can try to be sensitive to it, but there's no way, it's like, the word dilemma is overused. Well, this is a place where the word dilemma fits. You can't solve it. You just got to constantly massage it and try to manage it.
We offered 15 separate dates, including Christmas Day and New Year's Day, in which we would be willing to go to Baghdad to fulfill the President's proposal. When the Iraqis did not pick up on that, I think around the 3rd of January, the President said, okay, that offer is no longer on the table. But again, in the spirit of making sure everybody understands we are willing to leave no stone unturned, I'm willing to have Secretary Baker go meet with Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz in Geneva. They picked up on that.
The final stone was turned, but would it turn Congress? On the 6th of January, the President came back from a weekend at Camp David to dine with the War Cabinet and finally decide whether to seek Congress's approval for the use of force.
It had been discussed in the deputies' meetings, it had been discussed in a number of places. This was one of a series, I will say, in this case with the President, Secretary of Defense, I think the Vice President was there, and Colin Powell, Brent Scowcroft, and myself.
I was one that was encouraging the President to go in December to ask support for the Congress. I felt the earlier the better.
The concern was that if we went to Congress and asked for a vote and they voted no, that would weaken our position. We always believed that the president had the constitutional authority to go forward and send the troops into combat and liberate Kuwait, and that we did not need an additional vote from Congress. That you had the Truman precedent, that in 1950 Harry Truman committed forces to Korea to liberate Korea after the North had attacked, that he did so under the UN Charter, which was a treaty ratified by the United States Senate, and that we had all the authority, the president had all the authority he needed to act in this case. I'm persuaded that that is a valid argument and that there was no legal requirement for us to go to Congress.
I developed some rationale for using the War Powers Act in a way which, in fact, would have done the same thing. And he said, "No, I want to do this."
But I don't believe he ever bought onto this idea that was being pushed upon him that you would completely ignore the Congress.
There was a good bit of back and forth on the issue. And my impression coming out of that dinner that night was very clearly that the president was leaning in the direction of going to the Congress. I think the decision was clearly we just cannot afford, again, given the history of Vietnam and all sorts of things that have preceded it, we simply cannot afford to take the risk of going into a major conflict without some expression of congressional support.
I think one of the things that made me nervous, quite honestly, is a lot of the crisis up to that point. We've been able to work it in the deputies groups or other groups. And suddenly this had been turned, it was no longer just a foreign policy or national security issue. This had become suddenly domestic politics.
Some members of Congress, quite legitimately, were a little uneasy about signing up to a proposition that, shall we say, might not be successful, or might be successful at great expense. And so there were a lot of political careers riding on this, not the least of which was the president's.
We all manned the telephones a lot. I'm not sure we changed very many votes, frankly, but there were a lot of phone calls made.
An awful lot of time spent on individual members, and either you had the president, but you also had, quite honestly, all of his chief aides and lieutenants involved with phone calls and meetings.
The arguments that I made to members of Congress were these. One, Saddam Hussein was not going to get out. Two, give the president the benefit of the doubt in a foreign policy matter. Three, don't let history record you being on the side of Saddam Hussein and against the American president. You may think that that's unfair, but that's the way history will record it. Please be on the right side. Let the president do what is right. Give him the flexibility. This is a sensitive foreign policy matter. The country supports the president. Public opinion polls show that there is support for what the president may have to do. Please don't be partisan on this matter. Give us a chance.
3 days before the vote in Congress, Secretary Baker arrived in Geneva to meet the Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz.
I don't think anybody ever believed that Tariq was going to be able to do anything or would have any flexibility whatsoever, but it was important that we at least make the effort to try and avoid a conflict. And I think having tried that and getting stiffed almost certainly did provide some additional help in the congressional vote.
What vital interest of the United States of America justifies sending young Americans to their death in the sands of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula?
He's given an ultimatum. He's told everybody he's going to kick ass.
Iraqi aggression has been stopped. It has been contained. Saudi Arabia was not invaded.
I will vote for that resolution.
On this vote, the yeas are 52 and the nays are 47. Senate Joint Resolution 2 to authorize the use of the United States Armed Forces.
The Senate gave the president the support he asked for, though by only 5 votes. He now had a mandate to go to war.
مشاهدينا الكرام، قدمنا لكم الجزئين الأول والثاني من البرنامج الوثائقي الغزو، وسوف نقدم لكم في الساعة 9:35 من مساء يوم غد الجمعة 7 فبراير لعام 92 على البرنامج الأول الجزء الثالث والأخير الذي صور بالصوت والصورة حكم القضاء الرباني الذي حل بطاغية العصر ليكون شاهدا على عدالة السماء وعودة الحق بتحرير الكويت.
And they came in and took their seats at the table. We took ours, and then they brought the cameraman in for the ritual photo opportunity. And somebody said, "How about a handshake?"